Rain streaked the windows of the Seattle ER, each drop a reminder of the chaos Julian Carter couldn't escape. At 38, he'd stitched up more hearts than he'd ever let near his own. But tonight, a young patient's fading pulse under his hands cracked something inside him. Love, he thought, was a ghost he'd buried long ago, until a stranger's voice would prove him wrong. Julian's scrubs clung to his skin, damp from the frantic pace of the night shift. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows on the linoleum floor. He leaned against the counter in the break room, sipping lukewarm coffee that tasted like regret. Another patient lost. A 19-year-old, hit and run. His boyfriend sobbing in the waiting room, clutching a ring he'd never get to give. Julian had seen it all before, too many times. He'd learned to lock his heart away, to keep his hands steady and his emotions steadier. Love was a liability in his line of work, a distraction he couldn't afford. At least that's what he told himself. He glanced at his phone. 2 a.m. His shift was over, but sleep felt like surrender. Instead, he pulled on his jacket and stepped into the Seattle drizzle, the city's pulse thrumming under his feet. Capitol Hill, with its neon signs and late-night haunts, called to him. He wasn't looking for company, just a place to drown out the echoes of the night. He wandered into the Saffron Spoon, a cozy cafe he'd passed 100 times but never entered. The bell above the door chimed softly, and the scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee hit him like a warm embrace. Behind the counter stood Leo Martinez, 34, his dark curls falling over his forehead as he kneaded dough with practiced hands. His apron was dusted with flour, and his hazel eyes sparkled with a quiet intensity. "Rough night?" he asked, glancing up with a smile that felt like it saw right through Julian's armor. "You could say that," Julian replied, his voice rougher than he meant. He slid onto a stool at the counter, the only customer at this hour. The cafe was small, its walls lined with mismatched art and shelves of cookbooks. A chalkboard menu leaned against a potted plant, its cursive promising comfort in every bite. Leo slid a plate of warm cornbread across the counter, unasked. "On the house. Looks like you need it." His tone was light, but his gaze lingered, steady and unafraid. Julian hesitated, then took a bite. The cornbread melted on his tongue, rich and buttery, pulling a sigh from him he didn't know he'd been holding. "Thanks," he muttered, unsure why the gesture felt so heavy. Maybe it was the way Leo watched him, not with pity, but with something softer, something dangerous. Julian wasn't here for connection. He was here to forget. But Leo kept talking, his voice a low hum over the soft jazz playing in the background. He spoke of his grandmother's recipes, of growing up in a tiny New Mexico town where being openly gay meant risking everything. "I left to find a place where I could breathe," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Seattle's not perfect, but it's home." Julian nodded, his guard still up. "I get that. Breathing's hard some days." He didn't elaborate, but Leo's eyes held his, like he understood more than Julian had said. They talked until the sky outside lightened, the rain easing into a mist. Julian left with a takeout bag of cornbread and a feeling he couldn't name. He told himself it was nothing, just a kind stranger and a warm meal. But as he walked home, the weight in his chest felt different, lighter, like a door he'd locked years ago had been nudged open. The next week, Julian found himself back at the Saffron Spoon. He told himself it was for the coffee, but the truth was in the way his pulse quickened when Leo's smile greeted him. The cafe became his refuge, a place where the world's sharp edges dulled. Leo's stories of cooking for his siblings, of late-night experiments with spices, drew Julian in, each word a thread weaving them closer. One night, as Leo closed up, he invited Julian to stay. "Help me test a new recipe," he said, his grin mischievous. They ended up in the tiny kitchen, Julian chopping vegetables with clumsy hands while Leo teased him about his knife skills. Flour dusted the air, and laughter came easier than Julian expected. When their fingers brushed over a cutting board, Julian froze, the warmth of Leo's skin sparking something he hadn't felt in years. "You're not as tough as you think, Doc," Leo said softly, his eyes searching Julian's. The air between them thickened, charged with possibility. Julian wanted to lean in to close the gap, but fear clamped down hard. He'd built walls for a reason. Love didn't survive in his world. He mumbled an excuse and left, the night air cold against his flushed skin. Back home, Julian couldn't shake the memory of Leo's touch. He stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment. He'd sworn off love after his last relationship crumbled under the weight of his long hours and guarded heart. His ex, Nathan, had called him cold, unreachable. Maybe he was right, but Leo's warmth was a challenge Julian wasn't sure he could face. The next day, a crisis hit the ER. A mass shooting at a local club left the hospital in chaos, Julian at the center of it. He worked for 18 hours straight, saving who he could, losing too many. By the end, his hands shook, and his mind was a blur of blood and screams. He didn't plan to go to the cafe, but his feet carried him there, like a compass pointing to safety. Leo was there, as always, but his usual smile faltered when he saw Julian's face. Without a word, he poured a coffee and slid it over, his hand lingering on the cup. "You don't have to talk," he said. "Just sit." Julian sat, the silence between them heavy but kind. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in his exhaustion. Leo's presence was a tether, grounding him when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Weeks turned into months, and the cafe became Julian's anchor. He and Leo fell into a rhythm. Late-night talks, shared meals, moments that felt like promises. But Julian kept his distance, afraid of what giving in might mean. Leo never pushed, but his patience was a quiet pressure, urging Julian to confront the walls he'd built. One evening, Leo invited Julian to a community dinner at the cafe, a fundraiser for a local LGBTQ youth shelter. The place was packed, tables overflowing with food and laughter. Julian watched Leo move through the crowd, serving plates with a grin, his ease with people a stark contrast to Julian's guarded nature. A young trans teen, Mia, hugged Leo tightly, thanking him for the shelter support. Julian's chest ached. He knew too well the kids who came through his ER, bruised and broken by a world that didn't always accept them. After the dinner, Julian helped clean up, stacking chairs in the quiet cafe. Leo turned to him, his expression serious. "Why do you keep running, Julian? I see you. I know you feel this too." Julian's throat tightened. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I let someone in, it falls apart. I can't lose again." Leo stepped closer, his eyes fierce with conviction. "You're not losing me. I'm right here." The words hit Julian like a wave, washing away his defenses. He reached for Leo, their lips meeting in a kiss that was equal parts desperation and hope. It was messy, imperfect, but it felt like coming home. But the next day, doubt crept back in. Julian's past whispered warnings. Love was fragile, and his life was a storm. He pulled back, avoiding the cafe for days, burying himself in work. Leo's texts went unanswered, each one a stab of guilt. Julian told himself it was better this way, safer. But the emptiness grew, a hollow ache he couldn't ignore. The turning point came on a rainy October night. Julian was called to the ER for an emergency. A chef from a local restaurant, stabbed in a hate crime. When he saw Leo's name on the chart, his world tilted. He ran to the trauma bay, heart pounding, only to find Leo conscious, bloodied but alive, a knife wound to his shoulder. Relief flooded Julian, but so did fear. He worked with precision, stitching Leo's wound, his hands steady despite the storm inside him. When Leo was stable, Julian sat by his bed, unable to leave. Leo's hand found his, weak but warm. "You can't keep running, Doc," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm not going anywhere." Julian's walls crumbled. He stayed through the night, holding Leo's hand, the hospital's beeps fading into the background. He realized then that love wasn't a liability. It was the only thing keeping him whole. When Leo was discharged, Julian took him home, helping him settle into his small apartment above the cafe. They talked for hours, raw and honest, about their fears, their hopes. Julian confessed his past, the losses that had hardened him. Leo shared his own scars, the rejection he'd faced, the family he'd lost. But together, they found something stronger, a shared resilience, a promise to face the world side by side. Their first night together was quiet, just the two of them on Leo's couch, a blanket draped over their shoulders. Julian felt the weight of years lift, replaced by a warmth he hadn't known he could feel again. Spring came to Seattle, and with it, a new rhythm. Julian and Leo built a life together, imperfect but real. The cafe became their sanctuary, where they hosted dinners for the community, feeding not just bodies but souls. Julian volunteered at the youth shelter, using his skills to help kids like Mia. While Leo's cooking became a symbol of love, each dish a reminder that home could be found in unexpected places. One evening, as they closed the cafe, Leo pulled Julian outside. The cherry blossoms were in bloom, their petals falling like soft rain. Leo took Julian's hand, his eyes bright with something unspoken. "You saved me," he said, his voice steady. "Not just that night, but every day since." Julian shook his head, a smile breaking through. "You're wrong. You saved me. One word, here, and I stopped running." They stood under the blossoms, the city humming around them, and kissed, the world fading away. Love, Julian realized, wasn't lost. It was right here in the courage to stay, in the honesty of a single word. And for the first time, he believed it could last.